He thought her silence meant surrender, but silence is not surrender. It is power without permission, the kind that strips illusion from its last disguise. He mistook her stillness for softness, her restraint for fragility. Yet the moment she withdrew her warmth, the mirror cracked. And in that fracture he saw himself, not as he imagined, but as he truly was, a man terrified of losing control disguised as pride. Pride always trembles when it meets mystery. Because mystery cannot be possessed, it can only be met in truth. He called her distant, but what he really meant was, she stopped orbiting his validation. He called her cold, but it was the chill of reality brushing against his ego. Every projection he once wrapped around her body began to rot under the weight of its own falseness. He had built an image not of her, but of the reflection his wounds desired. And when the real woman stepped out from beneath his fantasy, he mistook revelation for betrayal. There is a violence in awakening. It's not the strike of hand or word, but the collapse of illusion that once made you feel powerful. She didn't destroy him, she revealed him. The part of him that could only love through domination, that could only feel safe when adored, that called control intimacy. But a woman who knows herself cannot be controlled. She becomes a mirror too clear for a man hiding from his own shadow. He wanted devotion but not reflection. He wanted her light without facing his darkness. And when she turned silent, his world began to hum with a new frequency, one that whispered the truth he had buried beneath performance. Her absence echoed louder than her presence once did. That's the irony of power. It's not felt in proximity, but in the space where one once stood, untouched, unbent, unforgettable. He began to chase her shadow, not her body, because what he lost wasn't a woman, it was the illusion that he was enough without depth. Pride told him he was losing control, but what he was truly losing was the mask, and men built on masks cannot bear unfiltered eyes. She didn't punish him. She simply stopped offering him the stage of her empathy, and when the performance ended, the actor saw the emptiness behind his own applause. That is the moment every proud man fears, the silence after the illusion ends, when the mirror no longer flatters but reflects. In Jungian language, what he saw in her was his own anima, the feminine within him that he never dared to understand. He adored it in her because he repressed it in himself. But repression breeds projection, and projection births possession. He didn't love her. He loved the part of himself he had denied. And when she withdrew, he mistook his own disconnection for heartbreak. But that's the strange cruelty of psychological attraction. We fall in love with what we cannot integrate. He was drawn to her mystery because it mirrored his own disowned soul. Yet mystery is never meant to be captured. It exists to awaken remembrance. And when he could not control her, he called her dangerous. But danger is only the name the ego gives to freedom it cannot cage. There is a quiet kind of death when a woman detaches, not the end of affection but the end of illusion. She does not yell, she does not plead. She simply becomes what he feared most, untouchable. In that stillness, she rises beyond reaction. And for the first time, he stands alone with himself, stripped of the fantasy that made him feel like a god. But what happens when a man who once ruled through pride is forced to face the kingdom within? When no one kneels before his narrative? When every conquest turns to dust because he realizes none of it ever touched truth? He either collapses or awakens. He looks into the silence. Silence looks back, and somewhere beneath the ruins of his performance, something ancient begins to stir, a faint recognition of the self he abandoned for the illusion of control. That is where transformation begins, not in her return, but in his reckoning. For her, there is no victory. There is only release. Because women who walk in their own mystery do not win, they transcend. They know that power is not in domination, but in the refusal to perform. Her quiet became his undoing, her absence his initiation. And yet the story lingers, because pride never dies easily. It whispers that maybe she'll come back, that maybe he can rebuild the illusion once more, but deep down he knows. You cannot resurrect what was born from blindness. Once a mirror has shown you the truth, it cannot unsee. The night grows quiet. The mask lies shattered, and in the distance her silhouette fades into myth, the kind of myth that men chase not to find her but to find themselves, because she was never the ending. She was the awakening. He tries to forget her, but forgetting is impossible when what broke him wasn't her but what she revealed. Pride tells him to move on. Ego tells him to replace. Yet every new face fee. LS like an echo, familiar but hollow. Because no matter how many times he starts over, he is not escaping her. He is circling himself. He thinks he misses her softness, but what he truly misses is the illusion of power her softness once gave him. He mistakes control for intimacy and attention for love. In every woman he touches, he looks for her silence, the one that held no need to prove, no urgency to please. The silence that once exposed his smallness. The silence that burned. He begins to understand that mystery isn't a performance, it's the natural byproduct of a woman who belongs to herself. And that kind of woman terrifies the half-grown masculine, because her value cannot be negotiated. Her emotions are not currency. Her distance is not punishment. It is order. There is something profoundly unsettling about a woman who does not need saving, who does not explain, who simply observes not from indifference but from sovereignty. He feels it like a cold wind on his pride, a reminder that she sees beyond charm, beyond narrative, beyond every layer he hides behind. She sees the wound, and that seeing, that ruthless clarity, is what undid him. The proud man thrives on performance. He builds identity from approval and self-worth from conquest. But when met with a woman who cannot be conquered, he is faced with a truth too unbearable, that his strength was never rooted in selfhood, but in reflection. Her refusal to orbit him became the mirror that stripped his illusion of control. He wanted her devotion to prove his dominance. Yet when she no longer worshipped, his confidence crumbled. Because his self-image was never born from truth, it was borrowed from her gaze. She was his mirror, and when that mirror shattered, the god within him fell. Still, he tells himself she was cold, distant, cruel. It's easier than admitting she was clear, because clarity destroys illusion, and clarity once seen cannot be unseen. He resents her for not fighting, not begging, not breaking. But what he calls detachment was discipline, the kind of quiet that comes only from inner knowing. There's an ancient law in attraction. What you reject within yourself, you will chase in another until you learn to face it. He chased her mystery because it resembled his unlived depths, and she, in her silence, became the doorway to his unconscious. But he tried to own the doorway instead of walking through it. And when the mirror closed, he called it heartbreak. Yet heartbreak is not loss, it's initiation. It's the collapse of projection, the death of fantasy. The pain he feels is not her absence, but the absence of illusion. The part of him that thought love was control is dying, and death, though painful, is sacred. She walks away without noise. The silence she leaves behind becomes a psychological desert. No validation, no performance, no audience, just him and his shadow. That's where men either break or are born. Pride will fight, ego will bargain, but the soul waits. Sometimes awakening doesn't come in light. It comes in darkness. When he sits in the ruins of his own illusion long enough, something ancient begins to hum. A whisper that says, perhaps this loss is not punishment but purification. Perhaps she was never the wound, only the mirror that made it visible. He begins to see the pattern. Every attempt to possess ends in loss. Every effort to dominate ends in emptiness. Control was never strength. It was fear dressed as masculinity. And fear, when unacknowledged, always seeks power over others. But when faced, it transforms into awareness, and awareness dissolves control. Stillness returns, not the silence of absence, but of understanding. He begins to remember himself, not the persona he built for love, but the self that exists without audience. That's where the true masculine begins, not in conquest, but in consciousness. She, somewhere far beyond reach, feels no need to look back, because her detachment was never revenge, it was alignment. When a woman rises into her own essence, she does not chase, she magnetizes. Her mystery becomes medicine for those ready to see, and for those who are not, it becomes a mirror too bright to bear. He now knows what she was teaching without words, that love without respect becomes addiction, and pride without awareness becomes blindness. What blinds a man is not her mystery, but his refusal to meet it with depth. He stands before the remnants of what once was, the ghost of a story that never truly existed. And in the echo of her absence, he begins to ask, not how to get her back, but how to meet himself. The mirror remains. It no longer flatters, it simply reflects, and that reflection is the beginning of his return. The nights grow quieter now. No messages to send, no games left to play, only the slow unraveling of pride thread by thread until the man beneath begins to breathe. This is where the illusion dies, not in a dramatic ending but in tea. He quiet moments when he realizes he cannot charm what he does not understand. He starts to see how much of his desire was hunger, not love. Hunger to be seen, not for who he was, but for who he wanted to believe himself to be. Every conquest, every chase was an echo of that same void. She simply held the mirror long enough for him to recognize it. And that is why she haunts him, not because she was perfect, but because she was real. Her mystery was never a tactic. It was the consequence of wholeness. A woman who has met her own darkness no longer bleeds for validation. She listens. She observes. She chooses with the precision of someone who no longer confuses attention with affection. And that kind of woman, the integrated feminine, will always reveal what a man is made of. He begins to remember how she looked at him, not with awe but awareness. Her eyes never worshipped. They weighed. They saw beyond his words into the subtle tremor beneath his confidence. That sight terrified him, because when a woman truly sees, she dissolves illusion faster than fire burns through silk. He called her complicated, but what he meant was she couldn't be controlled. He called her detached, but what he meant was she refused to abandon herself to soothe his fear. The truth was simpler, she was sovereign. And sovereignty to the unawakened masculine feels like threat. In her absence, he learns the paradox of polarity, that the feminine does not submit to dominance, only to presence. And presence cannot exist without consciousness. It cannot be faked. It cannot be performed. It is earned through self-confrontation, through shadow, through humility. He begins to see how his pride once masqueraded as strength. But pride is only strength in disguise, a fortress built around a frightened boy. The same boy who learned that love meant approval, that vulnerability meant weakness. And so he armored himself in arrogance, calling it confidence. She did not punish that armor, she simply withdrew from it, because the feminine never nurtures what refuses to evolve. Now the silence between them becomes a teacher. He hears it in the spaces where words once lived. He feels it when he touches someone new and realizes no surface can substitute depth. Silence becomes sacred, because silence reveals truth. And in that truth, he finds what no woman could give him, his own reflection. For the first time, he sees himself without performance. There is shame, yes, but beneath the shame there is something purer, an ache for authenticity, a longing to rebuild not from pride but from presence. Meanwhile, she moves through the world untouched by the noise of his realization, not out of cruelty but completion. She was the lesson, not the destination. And once her role was fulfilled, she dissolved from his narrative like morning mist, intangible, unforgettable, necessary. Still, her energy lingers not as a memory but as a mirror within him. He begins to understand that every woman he meets from now on will reflect the level of truth he can hold. The more honest he becomes with himself, the more depth he will attract. That is how the feminine tests, not through punishment but reflection. The proud man becomes the humble man. The hunter becomes the witness. And for the first time, he stops reaching outward and turns inward, not to reclaim her but to reclaim his soul. This is individuation. The path from illusion to embodiment, from ego to essence. The mirror has done its work. The wound has become the teacher, and the woman who once broke him now becomes the symbol of everything he was meant to remember. That love is not possession. That mystery is not manipulation. That silence is not distance. It is alignment. He will never see her again, not as she was, not as he imagined, but sometimes in a moment of quiet when the world stills and his mind no longer argues, he feels her presence, not as longing but as truth. She was never his to keep, only his to awaken through. The mirror stands unbroken now, though it no longer flatters. It reflects a man stripped bare of illusion, a man who can finally see. He does not chase her anymore. He walks slower now, quieter. The air around him feels different, heavier with awareness, lighter with surrender. Pride has turned to dust, and from that dust rises something rarer, humility without humiliation. For the first time, he understands the difference between submission and openness. Submission bends for approval. Openness simply receives truth. He begins to see that her mystery was never meant to confuse him. It was meant to purify him. Because mystery in its purest form is not concealment, it is protection. The sacred always veils itself from those who approach without reverence, and he had approached her with hunger, not reverence. He took without presence. He desired without depth, and now he finally knows why nothing he took ever lasted. Her silence returns in fragments of memory, the way she paused before speaking, as if language was too small for what she knew. The way her stillness carried an authority no noise could imitate. He had mistaken that stillness for detachment, but it was something holier, the stillness of a woman who has made peace with her shadow. Such women are dangerous, not because they destroy, but because they awaken. He feels the echo of her energy in everything that now falls away. The conversations that bore him, the shallow victories that once thrilled him, the connections that feel transactional. Everything false begins to decay. Because once you have tasted truth, illusion becomes poison. He learns to be alone, not in loneliness, but in observation. In that solitude, he meets himself not as a role, but as essence. The man who emerges from that meeting is quieter, sharper, and no longer afraid of softness. Because softness, when owned, is not weakness, it is strength restrained. This is what she meant when she said nothing. Her silence was an initiation. It forced him into depth without instruction. She was the unspoken scripture, the living paradox, warmth wrapped in distance, compassion concealed by boundaries. The feminine in her pure form, magnetic, still, and unmoved by flattery. He realizes now that his pride was never about her. It was his fear of insignificance. He needed to be chosen to prove his worth. But she never chose from need. She chose from resonance. And that is what made her powerful. Her love was not a reaction, it was recognition. When the recognition ended, so did her offering. For a moment, he wonders if she ever thinks of him. But then he understands. It doesn't matter. The point was never reunion, it was revelation. She entered his life not to complete him, but to fracture the mask he mistook for selfhood. And once the mask shattered, her presence was no longer required. Still, the memory of her remains not as longing but as a compass. Whenever he drifts toward illusion, her silence returns like a tide pulling him back to truth. That is how mystery works. It leaves traces, not answers. It transforms through absence, not touch. And the deeper he descends into awareness, the clearer he sees that what drew him to her was the same force that frightened him, the feminine as mirror to his unconscious. Every time she withdrew, it was not rejection but reflection. She was showing him where he had abandoned himself. The distance he felt from her was the distance within. The truth of love, he realizes, is not fusion but polarity. It is two sovereign beings meeting without need to possess. It is tension without conquest, attraction without imprisonment. And that kind of love cannot exist until both have faced their shadows. She had already met hers. He had not. That was the imbalance. Now he walks the slow path of integration. He listens more, speaks less, feels deeply but clings to nothing. He has stopped chasing validation in eyes that cannot see him, because now he sees himself. And that vision, quiet, unflinching, whole, is worth every loss that brought him here. She, somewhere beyond the reach of time, carries on unbothered. Her detachment remains his initiation. Her mystery remains his memory. Her silence remains his scripture. And one night under a quiet sky, he smiles, not because he won, not because he forgot, but because he finally understands. Mystery was never meant to be solved. It was meant to be revered. There comes a point when even memory becomes still. The ache that once clawed through him begins to dissolve, not because it has vanished, but because it has been understood. Pain only clings to those who resist its message. Once integrated, it becomes power. Once witnessed, it becomes peace. He has walked through his own ruins, through the echoing halls of every illusion he built to avoid the silence she left behind. But now, the silence no longer mocks him. It grounds him. It no longer feels like absence, it feels like presence stripped of noise. He finally grasps what her mystery truly was, consciousness wrapped in flesh. The feminine not as emotion, but as awareness. She didn't hide, he simply lacked the depth to perceive her. Mystery, after all, is only mystery to the unseeing. To the awakened, it is clarity. He once thought love meant merging, becoming one. But now he understands that true union begins only after separation. For without distance, there can be no perception. Without loss, there can be no reverence. It is the very space between them that made her visible, and that visibility, the shock of seeing truth unmasked, is what began his awakening. He remembers the last time he looked at her. The way she didn't flinch, didn't justify, didn't beg. She simply stood in her knowing, calm, unshaken, ancient. Her silence wasn't cold, it was exact. It said, "I will not meet you in your illusion. Come back when you are whole." That was her boundary, her offering, her final mercy. And now, after all the nights he cursed her distance, he understands that what he called cruelty was actually compassion. Because compassion without clarity becomes codependence, and love without discernment becomes decay. She loved him enough to stop saving him. That is the highest form of love, the one that walks away before illusion devours both. He used to believe strength meant control. Now he knows it means containment, the ability to hold what once overwhelmed, to stand before chaos and not collapse into reaction, to feel fully but not lose oneself in feeling. This is what she embodied, and that embodiment was what his pride could never match. He has stopped seeking the next woman to heal him. He no longer confuses feminine presence with feminine approval. He moves through the world with quieter eyes now, ones that see beyond beauty into energy, beyond charm into truth. And when he meets women now, he no longer asks, "Will she choose me?" But instead, "Can I remain myself while I meet her?" That is what individuation feels like, the merging of strength and surrender, of consciousness and compassion. The masculine reborn not as ruler, but as witness. No longer threatened by mystery, but anchored within it. Some nights he still feels the pull, the memory of her gaze, the echo of her distance. But now, instead of reaching outward, he closes his eyes and meets that energy within. He realizes she never truly left. She transformed. Her presence lives in his awareness now, not as longing, but as integration. Because the anima, that inner feminine he projected onto her, has returned home. What he once sought in her, he now cultivates in himself. Depth, intuition, stillness, receptivity. What he once worshipped in her mystery, he now honors in his own consciousness. He no longer fears losing control because he no longer mistakes control for safety. Safety, he learns, is not in power over others but in intimacy with truth. And truth, unlike illusion, does not flatter. It cleanses, it burns, it heals. And she, wherever she walks now, remains untouchable not because she is unreachable, but because she no longer exists in his world of need. She exists in awareness, in sovereignty. To meet her again would require him to rise thereto, beyond ego, beyond fear, beyond hunger. Only then could he meet her as equal, not as seeker. Perhaps that reunion will never happen. Perhaps it already has, in silence, in psyche, in the quiet recognition that what once broke him also rebuilt him. She was both mirror and initiation, shadow and light, destruction and resurrection. The man who once needed her validation now walks with her essence inside him. The woman who once held his projection now lives free of it. The illusion has ended. What remains is truth, unspoken, unchained, eternal. The woman who knows her worth does not argue, she vanishes.